Now, I know what you might be thinking. Trains in a Sonic game? And for starters, how can you even make a video about trains in Sonic? Well, believe it or not, there actually are a handful of trains featured throughout the franchise's nearly 30 years worth of games, many of which play an integral role for a specific level. With that said, and me being an avid Sonic fan and rail fan, I'm here to discuss the various locomotives and freight cars seen throughout the Sonic games. I'll be covering the aforementioned categories for each game, move on to the next, and repeat. So let's get into it. The trains of Sonic the Hedgehog. The first game I'll be covering is 1998's Sonic Adventure, though I'll be using the director's cut for this video. The train to Mystic Ruin seems to be freelanced, though it seems to follow the design style of the Japanese National Railways, or JNR for short, KISO 07. It was built from 1935 to 37 along with a modified version in 1952. Initially, the cars were designated the 42000 series, but later called the 07 by JNR in 1957. The diesel railcar was built at several locations in Japan and predominantly used in fast, urban commuter service around Tokyo and Osaka. Around 1955, they were displaced to smaller private railways in more rural parts of the country. They'd then be retired from service in 1969. Out of 73 total built, only 3 were preserved, one of which was operational at the Dowa Mining Katagami Railway until it closed in June 1991. The equipment, including railcar number 702, was moved to the Yanahara Furai mine park in Masaki of the Okayama Prefecture. Back to Sonic, an interesting note in the Dreamcast version, the railcar is red as opposed to the blue with a yellow stripe in Director's Cut. Another item of notice is the pantographs on the model, which the real-life KISO 07 does not have. Pantographs are an apparatus mounted to the top of electric trains to allow electricity from overhead wires to pass into the locomotive's traction motors. Sonic Adventure lacks any overhead railway wires, making the appearance of a pantograph seem strange. Though I'll cut it some slack since Sonic isn't a train simulator after all.
Something bugging you?
Moving on to Sonic Adventure 2 and City Escape, we find this cable car. With City Escape being based on San Francisco, California, it only makes sense the car is based on those seen in the real-life city. Cable car service in the city began in 1873, and the cars move using cables implanted in a trench within the streets. A central powerhouse produces electricity, which drives large wheels in the powerhouse to pull the cables. Each cable car is latched onto the cable in the street and gets pulled along the rails. A gripman uses a lever to tighten or loosen the grip on the cable and then can use the brakes to speed up, slow down, or stop the car where necessary. The cars seen in-game appear to be based on those used on the Powell to Hyde Street line. Most cars for the line were built between the late 1880s and mid-1890s. Since then, though, they've gone under extensive rebuilds and some all-new cars were built between the 1960s and 90s to replace some of the original aging cars. While relatively new compared to the originals, they still retain a vintage design. Also seen in City Escape are these large wooden circles. This is a turntable used to turn the cable cars around at the end of the line. Later on in the game at Pumpkin Hill, there's a ghost train with a pumpkin face. There's really no basis for it since it's a pretty cartoonish looking train, though if you really wanted a comparison, it does somewhat resemble locomotive number 1 of the narrow gauge KISO Forest Railway. Used to haul passengers and logs, it was built in 1916 and now resides at the Akazawa Forest Railway. Another game not safe from train fever is Sonic Riders Zero Gravity. MAGLEV Station has a futuristic hovering train speeding around overhead. While the train is pretty futuristic looking, it does bear some resemblance to the German MAGLEV that was tested and later cancelled at the Emsland test facility. It also shares an appearance with the much more successful Shanghai China MAGLEV. MAGLEVs work by using very strong magnets that repel each other, allowing the train to essentially hover, thus eliminating direct friction or drag with conventional trains. The aforementioned MAGLEV systems have registered in speeds as high as 268 miles an hour. In-game, the trains follow floating track paths, which isn't really something reality has achieved yet, but regardless of that, they still do follow the concept of a MAGLEV train in some way or another. The horn on the trains isn't exactly accurate for a MAGLEV either, and it's a horn you'd mainly find on an American or Canadian railroad. The other train is likely just another fictional futuristic design, but the closest comparison I could make is the JR Central 371 series used between 1991 and 2014. You probably already know the ill-fated story of Sonic 06, so I won't bother you to rehash its rushed development tale. Instead, I'll tell you about the 3 types of trains found in the game. For ease of recording and gameplay, I'll mostly be using the fan-made work-in-progress PC port of the game. We'll start off with these orange freight locomotives seen towards the end of the first act in Radical Train. These locomotives are based on the SD40-2W. This unit was built by Electromotive Division, or EMD, beginning in 1975 for the Canadian National Railway. The SD40-2W is a variant of the SD40-2, first built in 1972. The W stands for wide cab. A standard SD40-2 cab nose doesn't take up the entire width of the frame, whereas the SD40-2W has a full width cab nose known as a Canadian Comfort Cab. Now regarding the paint scheme, it's a bit similar to the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, or BNSF, railway as well. The horn sounds like those used on Japanese Shinkansen trains. This, of course, isn't quite accurate for North American locomotives like those seen in-game. Meanwhile, Elise's train, or properly known as the Soliana train, appears similar to the Kiha 150. The 150 was built by Fuji Heavy Industries from 1993 to 95. It operates as a DMU, or Diesel Multiple Unit train set. Each car has its own engine, but also works as a passenger compartment. The in-game model is much longer than the real-life engine, and the door locations are indented as well. The wheel sets are also ones used for freight cars, and not locomotives. The next and the last train of Sonic 06 is the Egg Train. This is quite the futuristic and streamlined looking train, but it does take some inspiration from the Pennsylvania Railroad's S1 locomotive. This locomotive was an experimental design by Art Deco era industrial designer Raymond Loewy. It was built in January 1939 for the Pennsylvania Railroad using a unique wheel arrangement known as a 6-4-4-6. 6 pilot wheels up front, 2 sets of 4 driving wheels in the middle, and 6 trailing wheels. At 140 feet 2.5 inches and 1,060,010 pounds, it was the longest and heaviest rigid frame steam locomotive ever built. It was designed for passenger trains running at just over 100 miles an hour. However, this engine had its fair share of issues. As revenue runs were conducted between Chicago, Illinois and New York City, it was revealed that its massive size made it impossible to navigate some of the clearances on the Pennsylvania Railroad system. In its final years of service leading up to 1946, it was restricted to a main line between Chicago and Crestline, Ohio. It would be scrapped in 1949 as the only one ever built. The Sonic 06 model shares the large streamlined nose features and relatively flat top of the locomotive. Other than that, it's kind of its own thing and own design, really. Moving on to rolling stock, or in other words, freight cars, the flat cars that the locomotives are pulling seem to be of typical American design. In the PC port of the game, intermodal containers have been added to them. This is a practice more commonly seen in Europe and Asia, though isn't unheard of in the United States. Containers are usually loaded in what's known as a well car in the United States and Canada. Sonic Generations revisits City Escape, and in that case, revisits the San Francisco cable cars in HD. However, these are based on the California street cable cars instead. While they function the same as the aforementioned Powell to Hyde Street cars, the California street ones were mostly built in the early 1910s and possess a different paint scheme and different markings. Other than that, nothing else really significant about the car and game. Last but not least is Sonic Mania. In Mirage Saloon Zone, we are greeted with an Old West American steam locomotive. It's based on the classic American design first introduced in 1836. Having 4 pilot wheels up front, 4 driving wheels, and no trailing wheels, the type would be developed into a more refined and stylized locomotive around the mid to late 1840s. 2 early examples are Boston and Maine Railroad No. 9, built in 1846, and Western and Atlantic Railroad's the Yonah locomotive, built in 1848. A more classic example is the Western and Atlantic's the General locomotive, built in 1855. The notable and large smokestack was needed to catch the sparks created from early steam locomotives burning wood instead of coal or oil. In Sonic Mania, apart from Eggman's facial features on the front and cartoonish proportions, the locomotive and tender are pretty accurate. Most of these locomotive designs were retired by the early 1900s. The same could be said for the freight cars, as they're pretty generic American-looking designs from the era, though would probably be made of wood instead of steel. Well, that's all the trains that I could find within the Sonic series. While trains don't necessarily have a deeper meaning in the Sonic series like trains may have in something like Half-Life, speaking of Half-Life, I do have 2 videos similar to this one known as the Trains of Half-Life and Trains of Team Fortress 2 if you're interested. They're nonetheless interesting and usually fun stage features or gimmicks. But in the end though, there are 2 things that trains and Sonic share. They're fast, and they're pretty darn cool.